Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into a world of salt spray, creaking oarboats, and the earthy squelch of seaweed underfoot. Imagine it now, a pale dawn hanging over the rocky coastlines of Norway, where tufts of kelp glisten like emerald ribbons in the cold air. You're not in your bed anymore. You're trudging along a narrow path worn smooth by generations of boots and bare feet, a burlap sack over your shoulder, and the tang of brine thick in your nostrils. Your hands are raw from yesterday's haul, and your tunic still smells like something that's been dead for a while, which, honestly, it probably has. All around you, the world is gray and green and wet. A sea mist curls over the fjord like a sleepy cat, and the cries of seabirds echo in the crisp morning hush. Somewhere nearby, you hear the low grunt of oxen pulling a creaking cart full of steaming kelp, and you already know it's going to be another long day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've arrived at the edge of a Viking settlement, not the raiding and pillaging kind you always hear about, but the quieter, muddier kind. This is not a place of glory and gold. It's a place of cabbages, a place of goats, a place of backs bent to the rhythm of seasons and tides. Here, the real Viking strength isn't in swinging swords, it's in coaxing food from the stingy earth. And today, your job is all about seaweed. You walk past a crooked fence made of driftwood, lashed with ropes that have seen better decades. In the distance, a thatched roof glistens with dew. Seaweed lies in matted clumps beside nearly every field, steaming faintly in the morning light. It's not just trash from the shore, it's treasure. This stuff is fertilizer, insulation, medicine, animal feed, and sometimes even dinner. And yes, it smells terrible. You probably won't survive this if you're a picky eater or have delicate modern nostrils. But in this salty little world, seaweed is life. Historians still argue whether the practice of seaweed fertilization was passed down through oral tradition or picked up by trial and error. Maybe one day, someone dumped kelp on a barren patch and noticed how fat the turnips got. Or maybe it's one of those things people just knew, like how to avoid eating certain mushrooms, or how not to anger the local land spirits. Either way, by the time you showed up, the seaweed method was already well established. The coastal soil here is thin and acidic, not exactly prime agricultural real estate. But the Vikings, they were nothing if not stubborn. If you give them a rocky slope and a heap of dead sea plants, they'll grow barley on it. And not just any barley, the kind that gets turned into flatbread, porridge, and occasionally, beer. That's right, seaweed indirectly supports happy hour. You're welcome. You head down a trail lined with shallow ditches. The Vikings dug these on purpose, not just to drain excess rainwater, but also to guide decomposing seaweed into the roots of their crops. It's like ancient plumbing for compost. You crouch down and touch the edge of one, and it's squishy, cold, and weirdly alive smelling. Somewhere in the distance, a child's voice calls out, likely warning about a rogue goat in the cabbages again. You smile. Even in the 10th century, goats are chaos. Back at the shoreline, a group of farmers, mostly women today, are hauling fresh seaweed in wide wicker baskets. It's a backbreaking job, done barefoot on slick stones, and every step threatens to turn your ankle. But they laugh through it, share gossip, and sometimes sing songs with lyrics too salty for daylight. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some folklore claim that seaweed gathered on certain days, especially after a storm, was extra potent, as if Odin himself had stirred the sea just to fertilize your rutabagas. There's even one saga snippet that mentions a seaweed harvest that came with a strange blue glow. Hallucinations, bioluminescence, or just the early medieval version of clickbait? You gather an armful of the slick stuff and stumble back up toward the farm. It squishes under your arm like wet pasta, releasing that glorious combination of salt, decay, and potential. Seaweed is rich in potassium, nitrogen, and something vaguely magical. Unlike manure, it doesn't burn plants when it's fresh. You can lay it right on the field, no waiting. You help lay the first layer over a patch of struggling turnips. Each handful is like tucking in a blanket of nutrients. Worms love it. Roots love it. Even the local birds poke through for grubs and bugs. You just try not to think too hard about what's living in there. The older farmers eye your technique and nod approvingly. You're getting the hang of it. One of them, a weather-beaten woman named Brynhild, tells you that her grandfather claimed seaweed kept the spirits of the land happy, that the salt fed the bones of the ancestors buried beneath the fields. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's just what he said to get kids to haul more kelp. Either way, it works. Over time, the scent of the fresh seaweed mingles with earth, wood smoke, and the soft stink of nearby livestock. It's not pleasant, but it's grounding. You feel the rhythm of the place, the give and take, the waiting and working. The Vikings didn't just survive here. They built something lasting, and seaweed was a part of that. You sit down near the edge of the field, chewing on a piece of dried fish and watching gulls swirl against the gray sky. The sea crashes softly below. A wind picks up and carries the scent of brine inland. Funny how something that washes up with the tide can help grow the food that feeds entire families. And funny, too, how we forget these little things, the quiet ingenuity of people who had no choice but to make it work. No electricity, no GPS, no Amazon Fresh, just tide, toil, and a whole lot of kelp. You lean back and close your eyes, just for a moment. Your hands still smell like the sea, but your stomach is full. The crops are fed, and tomorrow there'll be more to gather. The tide is lower now, bearing the slippery stones and brown-green blankets of kelp that hug the shoreline like an old quilt. You step carefully, your boots sinking slightly into patches of sea moss, while your eyes scan for the freshest seaweed, the kind that hasn't gone sour in the sun or tangled too tightly with driftwood. It's harvest time again, and the villagers are already at it, their bent silhouettes moving slowly along the shore like patient shadows. You crouch and gather a damp handful. It's cool, almost slick, like nature's version of wet silk. The color is rich, deep olive with golden veins, and it smells like the edge of the world, salt, rot, and something oddly clean. You pile it into the basket strapped to your back, careful not to overfill too soon. These things get heavier than you'd think. A few feet away, a boy named Eirik yanks a huge sheet of bladderwrack from a tide pool and gives a triumphant shout. His hands are slick with the jelly from burst air bladders. He holds it up like he's won a prize, the long strands flapping in the wind like soggy banners. His grandmother, stoic and unimpressed, calls him back to work with a wave of her hand. This isn't a game. This is food. Seaweed, to the modern eye, is usually relegated to sushi rolls and spa treatments. But here, it's part of life. Your daily chores shift with the tides literally. The Vikings learned to read the rhythms of the moon like a second language. Full moon, bigger tides, more seaweed. You now understand that the moon didn't just light the sky, it governed dinner. There's an art to this harvest. You can't just yank it all up. You want seaweed that's fresh but not too wet, long but not slimy, mature but not rotten. There's a rhythm, a kind of choreography between you and the sea. You take a little, leave some behind. Always enough for next time. Always enough for the gulls and the worms and the quiet sea spirits people pretend not to believe in. Historians still argue whether Vikings believed seaweed had mystical properties or just practical nests. Some sagas speak of green ropes gifted by mermaids, others of warriors eating sea vegetables to gain strength before battle. Was it myth, metaphor, or did someone really see a Viking chomp down on raw kelp before swinging an axe? Either way, you're not biting into anything raw today, you're just collecting, and it's hard, cold work. Your fingers are numb and tingling. The wind cuts sideways off the fjord, curling into your sleeves and stinging your cheeks. Somewhere overhead, a gull cackles like it's laughing at your human awkwardness. The farmers have a system. Some gather, some haul, and others, usually the older folk, sort the haul on shore. You bring your bundle up to a woman with a face like leather and hands like driftwood. She nods and adds it to a growing pile that is already steaming faintly in the chill air. That's the good stuff, she says. That'll go on the cabbage beds tomorrow. You take a moment to breathe in. There's something deeply satisfying about this work. It doesn't scream glory. It doesn't ask for applause. But it keeps people alive. Your back aches, your nose is running, and your hands are stained with iodine-rich slime. And still, you feel good. Grounded. Like you've plugged into something ancient. Nearby, a young girl lays seaweed in neat rows on a wooden rack, ready for drying. This batch is destined for rope making, not farming. Yes, rope. Turns out dried seaweed, when twisted and braided, makes a surprisingly sturdy cord. Not as strong as hemp, but lighter and, in a pinch, almost edible. Again, Vikings. Masters of the good enough solution. One of the older men tells you, half-jokingly, that his grandmother used to feed the pigs dried seaweed in winter. Said it made the bacon salty from the inside out. You're not sure if he's serious, but you make a mental note to never question Viking pork. A few villages away, the seaweed use gets even weirder. Some farmers there boil it down to a kind of gel and mix it into animal salves. Others, brace yourself, lay sheets of seaweed on their roofs to help with insulation. Apparently, nothing says warm and cozy like fermented kelp on your head. There's also a fringe belief, whispered by a few elders, that seaweed harvested during a solar eclipse becomes especially fertile, moon-pulled, sun-cursed. They call it. No one's quite sure what that means, but it sounds metal. Back on the beach, you're watching a family unload an entire boatload of seaweed. The vessel rocks gently in the tide, filled to the brim with glistening greens and browns. It looks like they've hauled in a sunken forest. One man leans over the edge, using a long rake to grab more from the shallows. You give them a hand, helping balance the weight as the bundles get passed from boat to shore. Slipping once, you nearly tumble face first into the surf, but a quick grab from a nearby farmer saves you, and you both share a tired laugh. You smell like wet dog now, but that's the price of glory. As the tide begins to rise again, signaling the end of the gathering window, you stand at the edge of the beach, staring at the shifting water. Behind you, carts creak under their burden. The last of the bundles are being hauled toward the fields, where tomorrow's chores await. For now, though, you're done. The mist begins to fall again, soft and slow. It beads in your hair and seeps into your boots, but it also carries a kind of peace. The world narrows down to the sound of surf, the whisper of wind through kelp, and the satisfying ache in your muscles. You sit on a flat stone, unwrapping a hunk of barley bread and a dried apple round you. Others do the same. It's not a feast, but it's enough. There's a quiet camaraderie here, everyone smelling of salt and sweat and seaweed. Everyone knowing they've done something vital. You chew slowly, watching the sea fade into silver under the coming dusk, and you realize something. In a life with no screens, no schedules, and no spreadsheets, there's beauty in doing just enough, in gathering from the shore, in feeding the land with the sea. Tomorrow, you'll spread this kelp across tired soil. You'll work it into the ground with a heavy rake, stomp it down with your boots, and pray that turnips grow fat. But for tonight, the job is done, and as the stars begin to wink into the northern sky, you wonder not for the first time how many other hands have done this before you, and how many will do it after. You wake before the sun, stirred by the sound of roosters and the familiar creak of carts being rolled toward the fields. Your back is sore from yesterday's bending and hauling, but there's no time to dwell on it. Today is for feeding the earth out in the fields. The frost still lingers at the edges of low stone walls, sparkling faintly in the early light. The wind is stiff, but it smells of wood smoke, wet dirt, and something darker, yesterday's seaweed haul, now sitting in dense, glistening mounds beside the cabbage beds. It's time to turn the shore into sustenance. The soil here is not kind. Thin, rocky, and often acidic, it clings to life grudgingly. But the Vikings had time, tide, and ingenuity on their side. You grab a wooden pitchfork and help start the process. The seaweed, heavy and cool, makes a thick slap as it hits the ground. You spread it in broad mats between the rows. This is the Viking version of mulch. Each stroke of the fork presses yesterday's harvest deeper into the dirt, mixing the salty greens with last season's dry stalks, and the ash from the hearth. The ground soaks it up like a thirsty sponge, and slowly, the earth comes alive with possibility. This is where rot becomes rebirth. Mainstream historians widely agree that seaweed was one of the most effective fertilizers available to pre-industrial coastal farmers. It delivered minerals that inland farmers could only dream of: potassium, magnesium, and trace elements washed in from the deep. But unlike dung or compost, seaweed could be used immediately. No aging, no curing, just pull, pile, and plant. You watch as the seaweed's glossy sheen dulls under the weight of the rake. Its air bladders pop under your boot. Somewhere between yesterday's salt water and tomorrow's sprouts, the transformation begins. It's quiet alchemy, and you're a part of it. A group of older farmers nod their approval. They've seen this process work for decades. Some even remember years when the entire crop depended on a single seaweed harvest. One tells you, with a grin, that he once grew onions the size of his head thanks to a lucky haul of storm-cast kelp. You glance at his head. That's a big claim. There's something strange and satisfying about using the ocean to feed the land. You think about how the roots of your barley drink in the sea, how the salt is tamed by rain and turned into sweetness. A kind of balance, perhaps. The sea gives, the earth takes, and people, caught in between, coax something edible from the middle. You kneel to push a clump of bladderwrack deeper into the soil, and as your fingers dig, you notice something moving: earthworms, fat, wriggling, and unbothered. It's a good sign. Where there are worms, there will be crops. One slithers lazily over your wrist, and you shake it off with a shudder. There's only so much harmony with nature you're prepared for at this hour. And now, a quirky detail. Some farmers believe that certain seaweeds called to specific crops, sugar kelp, for example, was said to sweeten carrots, while red dulse was better for leafy greens. Whether that was science or superstition, no one can say for sure, but Uray handed a bundle of red dulse and told to scatter it near the kale anyway. Tradition is tradition. The deeper you work the kelp into the fields, the more your arms ache. But there's satisfaction in the rhythm: lift, turn, press, repeat. The motion warms you. Steam rises from the damp mounds as the morning sun begins to do its work. Somewhere nearby, a child sings an off-key melody about a cabbage with legs. You don't ask. You just keep spreading seaweed. It wasn't just Viking farmers who used this trick. Similar practices occurred in ancient Ireland, Scotland, and even parts of Japan. The shared knowledge across these coastal communities suggests something deeply intuitive. You live by the sea. You feed the land with it. Still, historians debate how widespread the practice really was. Some believe it was a regional solution, confined to areas like the Hebrides or southern Iceland. Others argue it was practically universal among seafaring peoples with rocky soil and no cattle to spare for dung. Archaeological evidence is sparse: soil records degrade, and rotted seaweed leaves little trace. Much of what we know comes from old journals, farm records, and sagas. One fragment from an 11th century Norse poem compares seaweed to the old man's beard that brings forth grain. It's a vivid image, both weirdly accurate and weirdly gross, but it stuck with you. You tug at a piece of tangled kelp now, imagining the poet standing just where you are, hands dirty, heart hopeful. Around midday, the seaweed is fully spread and partially turned into the soil. Some rows are left blanketed in full sheets to retain moisture. Others get the mulch treatment chopped and mixed right in. The older farmers explain the strategy. Seaweed not only feeds the plants, but also helps trap warmth and protect young shoots from wind. It holds water during droughts and prevents weeds from stealing the show. It's almost like armor. Slimy, smelly armor. The Vikings knew a thing or two about that. As you take a break and chew a bit of hard cheese, one of the village elders points to a hillside just beyond the field. He says that during lean years, they layered seaweed with turf and ash to create whole new plots of soil. Artificial dirt, handmade earth, a farming version of IKEA furniture, only wetter. And here is a truly odd belief. Some families claim that seaweed enriched by the blood of fish, especially cod, produced even better crops. So when fishermen gutted their catch, the offal often went straight onto the kelp piles. It's efficient, it's gross, it's Viking. The workday ends with a few final rakes smoothing the field into strange, damp rows. You take a step back and admire it, not pretty, not pristine, but full of promise. This field, fed by the sea, is ready to bring life from the stone. You head back toward the longhouse, sore but satisfied. Behind you, the fields steam like resting giants, draped in strands of ocean thread. Tomorrow, you'll plant. Today, you've fed the ground. And as the last light bleeds from the sky, you can't help but feel it, that sense that in this quiet labor, you've become part of something very old and very necessary. You wake to the thick scent of compost and ash. The morning air is dense with fog, and for a moment, you can't tell where the sky ends and the ground begins. Everything is gray: your breath, the soil, the long strips of seaweed still glistening in the furrows. You stretch your arms and feel the dull pull of muscles worked hard and honestly. Today, it's time to bury what you laid down. Out in the fields, the seaweed has started to change. It no longer shines with that fresh, slick shimmer. It's duller now, darker, softening at the edges. You press your boot into a strip of kelp and feel it squelch slightly, releasing an earthy, mineral-rich scent. It's the smell of something rotting just right. The Viking farmers don't wait. There's no time to admire the decay. You grab a wooden hoe and begin turning the kelp into the soil, folding it in like batter into dough. It's heavy work. The earth here doesn't give in easily. Every clump of seaweed has to be mashed and mixed by hand. No tractors, no shortcuts, just grit. There's a rhythm to this labor, a kind of meditative repetition. You lean into it, pull, turn, press. The tool cuts into the softening kelp and meets the gritty bite of sand beneath. Your fingers numb, your back protests, but something about it feels right, natural. Like this is how it's supposed to be done. And all the while, the seaweed continues its quiet magic beneath your feet. Mainstream agricultural science supports what the Vikings learned by trial. Rotting seaweed doesn't just feed the crops, it transforms the soil itself. It breaks down fast, and as it does, it releases compounds that boost microbial life. Beneficial bacteria, fungi, and even helpful nematodes all wake up for a feast. You're not just feeding plants. You're building a microscopic army in the dirt. Of course, not everything about this process is pleasant. The smell, for one. Oh, the smell. What was once just briny and fishy has now taken on a deeper, richer tang, something between low tide and forgotten cheese. Some mornings, it punches you in the face before you've even left your bed. But strangely, you get used to it. Your nose adjusts. Your brain files it away under necessary evil. The quirky Viking trick for handling the smell: peppermint oil. Yep. Some farmers steeped wild mint in warm water and rubbed it under their noses to block the worst of the rot. You try it today, just a dab on your upper lip, and while you still gag a little, it helps. Plus, you smell faintly of chewing gum. Not a bad trade. There's a pause in your work as one of the elders calls everyone over to the communal fire. You gather with the others, warming your fingers on a cup of fish broth while someone reads out the tide tables, carved on a flat piece of driftwood. That's how you'll plan the next seaweed run. The ocean decides when you rest. The ocean decides everything. You sip your broth and look out at the steaming fields. It's beautiful in a way only hard work can make things beautiful. You know that underneath the soil, the seaweed is beginning to ferment, not in the putrefying sense, but in that rich, alchemical way that turns garbage into gold. There's a strange satisfaction in knowing your crops will be nourished by the same ocean that tries to drown you 6 months out of the year. Vikings didn't romanticize the sea. They feared it, respected it, and they learned to make peace with it in the quietest way possible, by folding it into their food. Historians still debate how deliberate this process was. Did Viking farmers understand the full science of seaweed fermentation? Probably not. But they knew it worked. They knew that if you worked the fields right, even the stingiest soil could yield cabbage and barley. And they knew that when the rot smelled just awful enough, it meant something good was about to happen. You return to your row and resume the work. The hoe feels lighter now, the soil more cooperative. The seaweed has softened into something halfway between mulch and mud. You catch sight of new shoots, tiny green specks pushing through where nothing grew last season. That's the reward. Not in gold or glory, just green things poking up through dead sea slime. And you smile. A nearby farmer tells you about an old trick passed down through his family, layering seaweed between root vegetables at planting time. Not above, not below, between. Supposedly, it acts as both nutrient source and pest deterrent. You help him dig the channels for today's potatoes, and sure enough, you lay the slices of kelp like sheets in a sandwich. It feels like tucking the tubers in for a cozy, salty nap. Elsewhere in the field, another group is doing something different, a form of composting trench. They dig deep pits, line them with older seaweed, and then bury them again. This is long game farming. That kelp won't feed this year's crops, but next spring, oh yes, it will sing. Somewhere behind you, a goat sneezes with drama. You turn just in time to see it trying to chew on a soggy piece of bladderwrack. Someone chases it off with a shout and a tossed clump of turf. Even the livestock are tempted by seaweed. In fact, some farmers intentionally fed their goats and sheep with dried kelp in the winter months, knowing it kept them healthier when other food ran low. Modern scientists now recognize the iodine content in seaweed as critical for thyroid health. The Vikings figured it out with nothing but trial, error, and the occasional lucky sheep. As the sun rises higher, warming the fog into mist and the mist into light, you take a moment to rest at the edge of the field. You wipe your brow, drink cool water from a clay jug, and look out across the dark, fertile rows. The kelp is no longer visible, but it's there, working its way into the roots, whispering to the microbes, feeding life with what was once nothing but ocean waste. And maybe that's the point. In a world where survival depended on grit and luck, the Vikings learned to look at what others might discard: the wet stuff, the smelly stuff, the slimy mess, and see potential. Seaweed wasn't garbage. It was a gift, a bridge between two brutal worlds, the sea and the soil. You sigh deeply and feel it settle into your bones. The kind of satisfaction that only comes from knowing your work will matter long after your hands are clean. Tomorrow, you'll plant more. Next week, you'll harvest the next tide. But for now, you rest. The seaweed is in the ground, the rot is happening, and the future is quietly beginning to grow beneath your feet. The next morning, you are met with a familiar squelch as your boots sink into the damp edges of the field. Rain fell overnight, just enough to turn the topsoil into sticky paste, and the seaweed you laid days ago has started to fuse with the earth in strange, spongy clumps. The whole place smells like wet rope and salt-stained root cellars. You wrinkle your nose. It's not elegant, but it's working. Today, your task is simple. Check the beds. Make sure the rot isn't too aggressive, the drainage is holding, and the slugs haven't launched another full-scale invasion. Ah yes, slugs. The unwelcome guests in any seaweed-fed field. At first glance, the idea of spreading thick, wet kelp across your farm sounds like an open buffet for these gelatinous freeloaders. And sometimes it is. You crouch beside a cabbage patch and peel back a flap of seaweed, only to reveal 3 fat, glistening culprits snoozing happily in the cool muck. You flick them off the edge of the bed with a practiced motion. One lands with a soft plop. It's a never-ending game of whack-a-slug. But here's the twist. It turns out that not all seaweed attracts pests. In fact, certain types, especially the saltier, more fibrous varieties like rack and dulse, actually deter soft-bodied invaders. The salt irritates their skin. The texture trips them up. And as the seaweed dries and forms a crust, it becomes a barrier, like a medieval palisade, but smellier. Some farmers even brew a kind of slug tea, a foul-smelling liquid made by soaking dried seaweed in water for a few days. It smells like a fish market left out in the sun, but when poured around young plants, it drives off everything from slugs to root-eating grubs. You're not sure if it's the salt, the minerals, or the smell that does it. Frankly, you're afraid to ask. You test this theory yourself, grabbing a half-rotted clump of rack from yesterday's pile. You lay it like a gooey wreath around a row of struggling beets. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it'll just stink up the place. Either way, it's worth a shot. Modern soil scientists now understand that seaweed isn't just fertilizer. It's a full chemical cocktail. Polysaccharides, cytokinins, auxins, compounds that stimulate root growth, strengthen cell walls, and boost a plant's immune system. The Vikings didn't know these words, of course, But they knew the effects. They watched sickly seedlings recover. They watched fruit ripen faster. They watched fields rebound from frost. Still, not all outcomes were predictable. Too much fresh seaweed could raise the soil's salt content dangerously high. Crops might wither, leaves could yellow and curl. Historians still argue whether Vikings deliberately leached their seaweed before soaking it in fresh water or leaving it to rain before application, or if they simply knew which varieties were safe to use fresh. You walk past a lower field where yesterday's rain has pooled in wide, shallow puddles. That's not good. The salt could concentrate there. A young farmer is already digging a drainage trench, muttering under his breath and trying to redirect the runoff. You help him shape a gentle channel toward the edge of the field, where the water can seep into the grasslands. One thing's clear: this kind of farming isn't passive. It's constant attention, constant adjustment. The seaweed is both friend and trickster. It gives generously, but only if handled just right. A curious old man, wrapped in a wool cloak that smells faintly of smoked fish, tells you a fringed tale. Some seaweed beds are cursed, fields where too much kelp was piled, where the land turned black and refused to yield crops for 7 years. Was it real? Maybe. Was it just an old excuse for a bad season? Probably. But you nod along anyway. Who are you to argue with a man who's survived 70 winters on this coast? You head toward the rye field next. There, the seaweed has already broken down into a slick black mulch. You press your boot into it and see it spring back, sponge-like. That's good. That means the decomposition is balanced, not too fast, not too slow. Fungi and bacteria are doing their quiet work, turning slime into strength. A group of children run past you, shrieking, each clutching a string with a tiny dried fish tied to the end. They're playing sea troll and turnip, a local game that seems to involve chasing each other with the threat of being fertilized. You pretend not to notice as one nearly crashes into your leg. Childhood, even here, finds its way into the cracks between chores. You squat by a patch of young onions. Their shoots are green, firm, just brushing ankle height. These rows had the seaweed applied in layers, thicker at the ends, thinner near the center. You compare the growth. Sure enough, the thicker patches have taller sprouts. Maybe it's the nutrients, maybe it's the moisture retention, maybe it's magic. You shrug and make a mental note. There's another, quieter benefit to seaweed that doesn't get mentioned often. Its effect on the feel of the soil. It loosens it, softens it, makes it springy and easy to work. You notice it most when your hoe sinks in without resistance, or when your fingers slip through the earth like digging in cake batter. It's a tactile kind of success. And here is another oddball detail. Some Viking families would actually taste their soil to judge salt content. Just a fingertip to the tongue. You try it. It tastes earthy, bitter, not too salty. You nod like you know what that means. You do not. By late afternoon, the sun peeks through the cloud cover. The fields shine with a dull gleam, where seaweed still lies exposed. The air is thick with scent, sea brine, damp soil, and something sharper, like iron and iodine. It's not pleasant, but it's alive. A flock of seabirds lands in a far corner, pecking at the softened edges of a compost trench. You watch them for a while, nature's cleanup crew, and then it hits you. This entire ecosystem is a chain. The sea feeds the land feeds the birds feed the next cycle. Nothing is wasted. Everything becomes something else. You lean on your hoe and exhale deeply. Your shoulders ache. Your fingers are coated in dark grit, and your tunic smells like it's been marinated in low tide. But the field looks good. The rot is just right. The soil is rich. You look down at your boots, now half buried in mud, and think, this is the price of growth, and it's worth every step. You sigh, and the breath fogs gently in the cold, salt-heavy morning air. It's just past dawn, and the glint of dew on low-growing seaweed makes it shimmer like threads of copper. You've been awake for hours already, like any proper Norse farmer, and your feet are damp inside your leather boots as you wade through the shallow tide pools again. The sea doesn't mind your intrusion. The waves just keep curling and pulling, tugging at your cloak and tickling the cuffs of your trousers as you bend down to collect another slippery armful of bladderwrack. This is no idle collection. The seaweed is a lifeline. You sling the latest bundle onto a creaking wooden sled, the runners of which you've greased with tallow so they glide more easily over the gritty shore. It's just simple engineering, but it works. You wonder, as you often do, why no one ever talks about Norse farmers the way they do about Norse warriors. All that screaming and pillaging gets the headlines, sure, but this daily trudge along the foamy shallows, the patient drying, hauling, layering, and tilling, that's where survival really happens. And here's the thing they don't tell you in most history books. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were some of the most surprisingly competent agronomists of their time. In coastal Norway, Iceland, and the northern Scottish Isles, places where soil quality ranges from marginal to utterly dismal pay, Opal had to innovate or starve. You weren't blessed with deep, loamy fields like those smug Frankish peasants to the south. No, your terrain is stingy. It grudgingly offers a handful of usable land here and there, usually in narrow valleys or wind-pummeled meadows. Fertility? Forget it. By the time you've hacked away enough stones to plant a single turnip, you feel like you've already earned your supper. Enter seaweed. The use of marine algae, especially brown seaweeds like Ascophyllum nodosum and Fucus vesiculosus, as fertilizer might sound fringe today, but in the Viking Age, it was genius-level resourcefulness. These plants are loaded with potassium, iodine, and micronutrients that boost soil health dramatically. Vikings wouldn't have known these words, of course, but they could see the difference. Seaweed made thin soil richer, helped retain moisture, and promoted better yields. You can just picture some old Norseman eyeing his cabbage patch and muttering, "Yes, good seaweed this year, fat cabbages." And unlike the manure piles of inland farms which, let's be honest, are steaming, fly-ridden, and deeply unpleasant to spread, seaweed smelled mostly like salt and brine, maybe even a little like kelpie tea, if you were in a generous mood. But let's not romanticize it too much. Gathering seaweed was hard, wet work. You had to time your collection carefully with the tides, avoid the slick rocks, and haul it all back up steep slopes to your field. It had to be laid out to dry a bit so it didn't rot too quickly, then mixed into the soil or used as mulch, and the quantity required was staggering. To see any improvement in crop growth, you needed literal tons of the stuff. This is where community came in. Norse coastal life wasn't as solitary as it's often portrayed. Seasonal labor, especially things like seaweed collection or fish drying, was shared among families, neighbors, and even between rival clans who otherwise couldn't agree on where your cow's fence should end. Some sagas even hint at passive-aggressive disputes over beach access. You might have fought your neighbor last winter over a stolen goat, but come spring, you're both knee-deep in seaweed, grumbling side by side. There's some archaeological support for just how widespread the practice was. Pollen analysis and soil sampling on Viking farms in Iceland have revealed surprising levels of salt-tolerant plants and marine minerals in the field's markers that wouldn't be there unless something from the ocean was regularly added. Seaweed doesn't fossilize well, but its effects on the ecosystem do. And when historians see raised soil fertility in places that shouldn't have any, they start sniffing around for algae. Here's where things get a little weirder. There's a theory still hotly debated that some Viking settlements may have encouraged the growth of specific seaweed beds by building tidal traps and wooden retaining walls. Basically, they managed wild seaweed like a crop, nudging nature just enough to create a semi-reliable harvest zone. Historians still argue whether these structures were meant for that purpose or if they were just erosion control. But you kind of like the idea of a Viking seaweed farmer quietly tending his algae, nodding to the waves like an old friend. And beyond the obvious nutritional perks for crops, there's another layer. Seaweed was used as winter insulation. Seriously, people lined the gaps in their turf houses with dried kelp or packed it around their root cellars. Think of it as Viking bubble wrap cushioning against the damp cold. It smelled a bit odd in warm weather, sure. But when you're huddled under a pile of wool blankets in February, any warmth is good warmth. There are even passing mentions in Norse poetry and sagas, always indirect, as if seaweed was too ordinary to bother naming directly. A character might trudge across weed-strewn shore to reach the field of his fathers, and you just know that field was green thanks to the briny boost. Everyday details, wrapped in myth. Meanwhile, you're still dragging that sled. Your arms ache, but the pile is finally growing, glistening like a dragon's hoard made of wet ribbons. You'll get it home, let it air a bit, and then tomorrow you and your sons will work it into the soil. With luck, next spring you'll have turnips the size of a baby's head and barley stout enough to brew a proper pint. Of course, not everyone used seaweed the same way. In some regions, it was reserved for the barley fields, in others, for root crops like onions and parsnips, and in the Faroe Islands, they even used powdered dried kelp to dye wool, adding an earthy greenish tint to woven cloaks, a fringe detail, perhaps, but one that paints a fuller picture of how completely the ocean wove into Norse daily life. It's funny, isn't it? You always hear that the Vikings conquered England, traded with Byzantium, and terrorized Irish monks, but you rarely hear that they quietly, patiently revolutionized sustainable farming on volcanic soil using nothing more than seaweed, tide charts, and communal labor. And there's something almost meditative about it. The rhythm of the waves, the scratch of seaweed against stone, the slow, repetitive motion of gathering and hauling. No swords, no oaths of vengeance, just survival, one salty bundle at a time. As you finally turn inland, sled creaking behind you, you catch the sun just lifting over the horizon. Its light glints on the frosted tips of seaweed strewn across the rocks, and for a second, the whole shore looks gilded. You squint, smile faintly, and start the long, slow climb home. And just as you're settling into the rhythm of the Viking homestead tools clinking, seaweed steaming in piles under the weak northern sun, you feel the whisper of a chillier breeze, one that carries you westward, not just west on the map, but westward across time, into the world of Norse trade routes and unexpected botanical exchanges, because it turns out that Vikings weren't just swinging axes and raiding monasteries, they were trading, borrowing, and quietly swapping tips on how best to grow barley on rocky soil. The North Atlantic trade routes might sound like something out of a pirate novel, but for Viking-age farmers, they were lifelines, and surprisingly, one of the things riding in those clinker-built boats alongside amber, walrus ivory, and the occasional enslaved unlucky monk was seaweed, not bundles tied in tidy twine, but rather the ideas about how seaweed could be used, processed, and revered. You see, the knowledge of seaweed wasn't static, it moved, slowly, in woven satchels and snippets of conversation. It moved between islands, coastal villages, and windswept fjords. You drift into Orkney, where a Norse-Gaelic fusion culture developed its own hybrid methods. The islanders had fewer trees than the mainland, meaning less ash for traditional fertilizers. So what do? They lean harder into the sea. Kelp is burned into ash to produce both potash for soil and soda for soap making. One plant, two uses, both smelling like overcooked spinach and the tang of burnt sea salt. Historians still argue whether it was the Vikings or the earlier Picts who started this particular seaweed combustion process. There's even a theory involving driftwood deities and ritual fire pits. But let's not get too cultish tonight. Just imagine a quiet inlet, a pile of stinking kelp crackling under flame, and a farmer squinting thoughtfully at the blackened powder left behind, wondering if this could make his turnips less embarrassing. And yes, even in Viking times, turnips were a little embarrassing. As you lean back deeper into your pillow, consider this. Vikings likely knew that burned seaweed could raise the pH of their acidic soils, not because they read peer-reviewed journals, but because a neighbor's field suddenly looked a lot less yellow and patchy. Word spreads. A cousin in the Hebrides tries it. Then someone's brother in Iceland starts stockpiling seaweed in his turf-roofed barn, just in case it rains sheep again. Because, yes, Icelandic weather. The thing about Viking farming is that it wasn't static, it evolved with every voyage. You had settlers bringing back Irish methods, Norman tricks, even Byzantine curiosities, all filtered through the fog of memory and salted fish. And seaweed knowledge was a part of that evolving web. They might not have had spreadsheets, but they definitely had seasonal calendars etched in wood or stored in weathered heads marking when to harvest bladderwrack or sugar kelp, depending on whether you needed to fertilize barley or feed the sheep something weirdly nutritious. And oh, sheep, You can't avoid them in Viking agriculture. They're everywhere, ambling through bogs, chewing on thatch, occasionally standing right in the middle of your fermented fish drying rack. Seaweed, it turns out, became an emergency winter food for livestock when everything else froze or was eaten by goats. With boundary issues, farmers noticed something strange. Sheep fed on certain seaweeds seemed healthier. They birthed stronger lambs. Their wool had more luster. Some even claimed their buying was more melodious. But we'll chalk that up to long winters and a lack of taverns. Of course, the science behind all this would come much later: iodine, minerals, trace elements, all that jazz. But for a tired Norse farmer, results mattered more than reasons. If seaweed made your sheep less likely to tip over in the snow, you used it. If it made your barley yield enough to get through winter, you said a little prayer to Njur and dumped more on the field. It's in these cross-cultural exchanges between Vikings, islanders, and the occasional visiting merchant that we start seeing the real seaweed revolution. Places like Shetland and the Faroes became mini experiment stations. One chieftain's wife might insist on layering seaweed under fish bones. Another swears by burying it deep and planting leeks on top. Some techniques work, some don't, and occasionally a jealous neighbor sabotages the compost heap by sneaking in a dead fish. Yes, Norse passive aggression was real, and somehow, amid the icy rain and grunting oxen, an unspoken agricultural consensus emerges: seaweed works. But you've got to know when and how to use it. Spread it too fresh, and your field smells like a rotting whale. Way too long, and it dries into something only goats will eat, and goats will eat anything, including your sandals. There's even evidence, quiet, water damaged, and fragmentary, that monks in coastal monasteries started copying Viking seaweed practices in the 11th century. One scribbled marginalia in an Irish herbal manuscript reads something like, "Works best after the spring tide, smells, but worth it." That's not the sort of thing you'll find embroidered on a tapestry, but it tells you so much. These were not just warriors and raiders, they were coastal scientists. In their own odd way, the seaweed trade itself never became glamorous. No one carved a dragon prow for the express purpose of hauling wrack, but it moved, quietly and persistently, shaping the agricultural practices of an entire seafaring world. And you, lying there, cocooned in your blankets, are part of a long chain of humans who've peered at a pile of wet sea vegetables and wondered, could this help my garden grow? Spoiler, it probably could. So now, as we leave the bustling, smoky inlets of Orkney and drift north again toward colder waters and sterner cliffs, you carry with you the murmur of trade winds and ancient knowledge shared across fire pits. Seaweed isn't just seaweed, it's legacy, it's connection. It is something you'll never look at the same way again. When you step on a slick patch at the beach and almost fall flat on your dignity, don't worry, the Vikings slipped too. The morning fog clings to your boots as you squelch your way through another marshy field, one that's suspiciously greener and more fragrant than the rest. That's no accident. You're walking over land that's been lovingly coated in rotted seaweed. The Vikings didn't just toss kelp around willy-nilly. They had a method, a rhythm, and frankly, a bit of seasonal drama. Tonight, you're going to live it. You hear the distant squawk of seabirds as you cross a slope overlooking the Norwegian coastline. Down below, in a shallow bay, a small group of Viking farmers is hauling in nets of tangled seaweed, their movements deliberate and unhurried. It's late spring, the perfect time. The tides are low enough to allow for hand harvesting, and the seaweed is at its peak, thick, dark, nutrient-rich. This is the golden moment. The men and women gather bladderwrack, knotted wrack, and a few tufts of sugar kelp, each species chosen for a specific purpose. Some will be used fresh for top dressing, others left to rot in great steaming piles, decomposing into a foul, almost mythic sludge that smells like old fish and wet wool socks. But to the Vikings, that's the scent of future abundance. Back at the homestead, it's a group effort. Seaweed is dragged uphill in woven baskets, laid out in thick mats atop tired soil. You notice the technique. They don't bury it. No, the kelp is spread like a blanket, slowly leaching its minerals down into the earth with every rainfall. Potash, iodine, magnesium, it's a Viking multivitamin for plants, The homesteads you pass vary in size, but nearly all feature some kind of seaweed management. Some hang it on fences to dry, others pile it in corners of the field like pungent treasure. A few more refined setups even layer it into compost heaps alongside animal dung and ash. And let us be honest, if you were growing barley on sandy coastal soils that barely held together in the wind, you'd be experimenting too. One man, the oldest in the group, faced like crumpled birch bark, leans on a pitchfork and tells you, in a voice you somehow understand despite the 1,000-year gap, "The sea gives us more than fish." Then he coughs dramatically, just to make sure you're paying attention. You follow him toward a field that's partway through its seaweed treatment cycle. In one corner, early spring shoots are poking through dark, glossy mulch. In another, last year's layer has nearly disappeared, absorbed completely. This isn't random, it's a rotation. Fields are rested, seaweed is aged, and nothing is overused. As your guide puts it, even the gods rest a patch of ground. You get the sense that the process is just as sacred as it is practical. There are quiet rituals here, little offerings tossed into the surf before harvesting, carved driftwood markers to designate drying sites, songs sung not for entertainment, but as memory aids. One tune sticks in your head, a chant about kelp and corn, and how not to anger the landvertier, the local land spirits. Apparently, even ghosts have farming opinions. Historians still argue whether these rituals were purely spiritual or partly functional mnemonics for managing a complex calendar of planting and gathering. Either way, you can't help but hum along. As you drift into afternoon, you notice that Viking children have joined the older farmers. They gather seaweed pebbles, giggle at the sea slugs hiding in the piles, and occasionally throw handfuls of drying kelp at each other like wet spaghetti. Farming, it seems, was a family affair, not just necessity, but community. One woman, dressed in thick wool dyed with lichen and madder root, shows you how she mixes chopped seaweed into her kitchen garden soil. "It keeps the carrots fat and the trolls away," she says, half serious, and indeed, the plants look suspiciously healthy. You spot onion stalks the size of oars and cabbages with a gravitational pull. Not all seaweed was created equal, though some varieties were too tough, too salty, or carried too many barnacles. Selection was a skill, passed down like a recipe. You recall the phrase from earlier, "The sea gives us more than fish," and now, you start to understand the weight of that. Quirkier still, in some regions, Vikings didn't just use seaweed for fertilizer. They used it for bedding, for insulation in shoes, even as a sort of sea-sourced thatch for temporary huts. In Iceland, kelp ash found its way into glass production. And yes, one eccentric chieftain was rumored to have commissioned a robe, made entirely of dried kelp strands, a walking salad, if you will. You're not sure that one's true, but you appreciate the drama. By evening, the fields glow faintly amber under the setting sun, and the briny scent of the sea mixes with wood smoke from nearby longhouses. The farmers take a break, passing around a leathery sack of fermented milk, an acquired taste. You decide quickly, and boasting gently about who collected the most kelp that day. You sit on a log, squinting at a small square of soil that earlier looked tired and unremarkable. Now, it's alive. You can almost hear the roots whispering their thanks beneath the surface. Tomorrow, they'll haul more seaweed in. The day after, they'll rest. Always in rhythm with the tides. No flashy tools, no big machines, just patience. Tide charts etched into driftwood, and the briny gift of a coastline that never stops giving. And as you lean back, eyelids heavy, you realize something. The Vikings weren't just warriors and explorers, they were quiet chemists, guardians of a living experiment that fed their people long before synthetic fertilizer ever darkened a feed store shelf. You probably won't survive a Viking raid, true, but given the right patch of soil and a bit of kelp, you might just grow something worth keeping. You're still walking. It's foggy again. The faint scent of salt clings to your cloak, mixed now with that unmistakable sweet rot of composted seaweed. You're trudging beside a Viking farmer, yes, a real one this time, barefoot and bearded, humming under his breath as he drags a wooden sled, laden with fresh bladderwrack. He's heading toward a field, not far from the shoreline, where the earth has been turned and shaped into gentle furrows. You glance over your shoulder, The fjord glistens faintly through the mist, and a few fishing boats bob in place, quiet silhouettes against the flat horizon. But this farmer has no interest in fish today. He's got seaweed on the brain and quite a bit of it between his fingers, too. He stops, grunts, and begins unceremoniously flinging the slick green mess onto the soil. You follow suit. Slippery. Wet. A bit like cold noodles that smell like ocean burps. Lovely. What he's doing isn't random. You're watching a carefully timed rotation in action. This isn't just fertilizing, it's fallow field preparation, Viking style, and it as part of a bigger pattern. How Norse agricultural cycles worked in tandem with seaweed collection each year, depending on the community's size and needs. Plots were rotated, some left fallow, others planted with barley or rye, but seaweed played a starring role in keeping the soil productive. It wasn't a one-time dump and dash. It was layered, turned, dried, and worked in. That dark green salad you're helping spread, it'll eventually melt into a mulch-like blend, rich in trace minerals and natural salts minus the preservatives. Historians still argue whether these rotations were formalized. Did they have an actual calendar? Or was it oral tradition, passed from hand to hand like a secret recipe? Some point to rhythmic land use patterns that echo Roman systems. Others say that's wishful thinking, and the Vikings just played it by ear or by algae. But here's a fun tidbit for your dreams tonight. In coastal Norway, some families pass down weed wisdom, folk sayings tied to specific tidal phases, like, don't spread kelp before the raven sings, or bladderwrack before frost is worth twice the hay. Okay, those may sound more poetic in Old Norse, but you get the point. By now, your boots or bare feet, if you've committed fully, are caked in kelpy mud. It squelches with each step, like soggy bread. You pause beside a small wooden marker, topped with a rough carving of Thor's hammer. Not for decoration. This was land magic. The idea was, protect the field, bless the yield, scare away nosy spirits, or jealous neighbors. A boy runs past, dragging seaweed in a basket. He giggles when you slip. You mutter something modern under your breath, but the Viking beside you just shrugs. The earth eats, he mumbles in thickly accented tones. Feed her right. You look out across the field, a patchwork of green clumps and dark soil. It doesn't look impressive, but give it a season or two and that barley you'll sip as ale by firelight. Yeah, it starts here. Another farmer down the row is doing something odd. He's digging a pit and lining it with seaweed, then layering it with animal dung, fish bones, and wait, are those crushed shells? Composting. Yes. Viking-style lasagna. This mixture breaks down slowly, fermenting over weeks, sometimes months, before being worked into planting beds. You wrinkle your nose, but admit it, this guy's soil is probably better than your houseplants ever will be. You lie back for a moment on a grassy knoll, letting the low sun warm your face. A gull cries overhead. The farmer keeps working, and so do the worms, unseen, weaving through this ancient, gooey mulch. There's a brief flashback now back to Section 4. Remember that coastal midden you picked your way through, full of fish bones and shells? Turns out, some of that waste made its way back to the land. Circular economies weren't invented by Silicon Valley startups, after all. And here's another nugget to chew on before sleep takes you. Archaeologists once uncovered a field where layers of seaweed had been deliberately arranged between layers of soil, suggesting not just fertilization but insulation. Was it a primitive greenhouse method, or simply an accidental discovery that caught on? Historians still argue whether this practice was standard, or a quirky fluke by one overly ambitious Viking with a kelp obsession. Time drifts. Mist rolls back and you close your eyes. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorts. The fields are quiet again, breathing, digesting, waiting. You'll move on soon. But for now, your body sinks into the hillside like a second layer of mulch. The seaweed steams gently in the afternoon light, and the cycle harvest, spread, weight carries on. You breathe in the chill morning air. The faint smell of kelp clings to your fingers. The dew hasn't yet dried on the earth, and as you trudge toward the field, there's a deep hush like the land itself is holding its breath. You stoop low, drag a rake through the softened soil, and behind you, One of the thralls begins unrolling bundles of seaweed that had been drying on a rough wooden frame. Seaweed in the Norse world was never just waste cast up by an ungrateful sea. It was potential. Power. Fertilizer. Vikings may be better known for ships, swords, and skull cups. Well, maybe not the last one. Historians still argue whether they actually drank from enemy skulls or whether that's just medieval PR gone wild. But farming was the backbone of Norse survival, and seaweed was an unsung hero. The dried kelp crackles softly as it's scattered over the earth. It doesn't stink anymore. A few days and the sun has burned off the brine, and what's left is a rich, dark ribbon of nutrients. You feel the satisfaction of ancient, practical knowledge in your bones, the kind passed down not through books, but through calloused hands and watching your elders through narrow eyes. As they grumbled through another season of sowing, you press a boot into the softened mix. It yields. That's good. The soil is more forgiving now, less acid from all that pine needle decay. Round the field, gulls wheel, shouting useless opinions no one asked for. You glance toward the coastline. At low tide, there's still time to collect more. The seaweed gathers in generous clumps, draped over rocks and pooling in little tidal basins. Brown, green, red, even a strange purplish slime that you're not entirely sure is alive or dead. It all has its use. Sometimes it's dug directly into fallow plots. Other times it's burned into ash, stored for later, or even mixed with animal manure for a supercharged slurry that could knock your nose off. Now, no one's saying Viking agriculture was glamorous. You didn't put on your best bear pelt and brag to your neighbors about your composting technique. But in communities where winters were long and unkind, soil fertility was a matter of life or slow starvation. Seaweed acted like a multivitamin for the land, full of potassium, nitrogen, trace elements, and iodine which, fun fact, some folks centuries later tried to extract from seaweed for goiter treatment. It aerated, compacted earth, retained moisture during dry spells, and when storms battered the coastline and dumped it in massive, tangled heaps, the smart thing to do was haul it inland, which you do, because you're smart, or at least tired of hauling water to dying barley. Your neighbor once tried to grow flax without it. He got for miserable stalks and one was eaten by a goat. He doesn't talk about it anymore. Over time, the technique became more refined. In some coastal settlements, people constructed lazy beds, long raised ridges formed by digging trenches and piling seaweed-stuffed soil in neat rows. You've seen the pattern. On windswept hillsides in Iceland and the Hebrides, there's something hypnotic about it, as if the land is sleeping under strippy blankets. But it wasn't just about food crops, no. The Viking relationship with plants extended to the spiritual, the medicinal, and believe it or not, the aesthetic. Seaweed was even used to mulch around the roots of sacred herbs like angelica or yarrow, thought to have protective powers. Whether it kept away evil spirits or just slugs is still debated. Probably both. Nature doesn't draw hard lines. Even in Greenland's more barren stretches, settlers clung to the practice. Written records from centuries later describe desperate efforts to maintain even meager soil fertility. And seaweed floating up like a gift from the deep must have seemed like a quiet miracle. At one point, you hear someone snort awake beside the stone fence. It's your uncle, who claims he's watching for cows sneaking into the field. In reality, he's been napping in the sun with a cup of sour whey clutched in his hands. You let him be. The cows aren't that ambitious. A young boy squats beside a pile of kelp and pulls out something shiny, a piece of drift glass maybe, or old fish bone. He holds it up to the light like it's treasure. And in a way, it is. The sea gives and the land remembers. You scratch behind your ear, where something itches, and wonder idly if it's from yesterday. A seaweed bath, a practice your grandmother swears by for soft skin and strong dreams. You'll never admit it worked. By midday, the rows are covered. The sun is warm on your back, and you stretch, satisfied. Seaweed has done its job. The soil is fed. The land feels less hungry. You didn't swing a sword today, didn't shout in battle, didn't earn a skald's praise. But this work, smelly, sticky, quiet, may have saved more lives than any warrior ever could. So you pack your tools, sling the empty nets over your shoulder. Tomorrow, you'll fish. Maybe trade some seaweed-wrapped barley loaves at the market if the weather holds. And if the old man with the bad knee doesn't grumble too loudly, you might even have time to nap beside the fence yourself. You leave the field behind, a patchwork of green and brown, the faintest hint of salt in the breeze. Far out on the tide line, another slick of seaweed awaits. You drag the basket a little farther along the rocky shore, its weight now a familiar rhythm in your shoulders, with the sun arsing lower in the sky, casting golden light across the fjord's glassy surface. You settle near another farmstead. This one, like the others, clings to life by the sea, but unlike the scattered clusters you've seen before, this place pulses with something more ambitious, an early communal effort to farm not just fields, but seaweed itself. The idea of organized seaweed farming might sound absurd to your modern sensibilities, conjuring images of underwater crop circles or kelp arranged in neat little garden rows. But here in the Viking Age, practicality trumps aesthetics, and what you see is the rough draft of aquaculture logs anchored in shallow waters, ropes tangled with brown fronds, and a few daring souls in boats carefully managing the lines. They're not just gathering what washes up anymore. They're planting it. This site represents a transition. At some point, historians still argue whether it was due to coastal crowding, a warming climate, or just good old Viking innovation. Some communities moved from scavenging seaweed to managing its growth. They'd noticed which coves yielded the richest harvests and began to mark, nurture, and protect those areas. Your feet crunch over crushed shells and bits of driftwood as you wander closer. A young woman is untangling a particularly stubborn knot of bladderwrack from a wooden pole. She nods in your direction but doesn't pause in her work. The bladderwrack is used not only for fertilizer, but occasionally brewed into a kind of tonic. Supposedly, it cures everything from sluggish digestion to melancholy. No, it's not modern medicine, but for someone in a time without Advil or therapy, seaweed tea is a start. There's also a touch of folklore here. Some claim that tending seaweed gardens pleases the sea spirits. A superstition? Maybe. Or maybe it's just a clever way to protect a valuable resource from poachers. You've noticed how many practical systems, whether land boundaries, night watches, or even marriage customs, are explained through myth. Perhaps that's the Viking version of marketing. A boy helps his grandfather scoop up loose fronds floating near the shore, using a net fashioned from twisted willow branches. The old man pauses to spit into the wind, then mutters something about not letting the green ropes float off to curse another village's fish catch. You're not entirely sure if he's joking. At the edge of the water, rows of drying racks stretch like strange skeletal creatures across the rocks. Seaweed is draped over them in lacy curtains, fluttering in the breeze. Once dried, it's easier to store through the winter, when frozen soil makes gathering anything fresh difficult. Some of it will be crushed and mixed with manure. Some will be set aside for animal bedding, or even traded inland for grains or iron tools. Turns out, seaweed isn't just nutritious, it's currency. The logistics are surprisingly sophisticated. Boats ferry bundles of fronds between nearby coves. Poles are marked with carved runes to designate ownership. Disputes over harvest rights pop up now and then, sometimes ending in quiet negotiations, sometimes with a broken or to the ribs. The Viking legal system has room for both outcomes. Still, you can't help but smile at the thought of a Viking seaweed committee arguing over the best stretch of kelp-covered coastline. The idea of these raiders and farmers, so often painted with swords in hand, calmly measuring tidal growth patterns and setting drying schedules, is both oddly charming and deeply human. Inland, the communal fields show signs of careful division. One area is already turned and fertilized with seaweed mulch. Another is being prepped by ox-drawn plows, crude but effective. You pause to run your fingers through the topsoil. It's rich, dark, alive. You can feel how different it is from the pale, sandy stretches just beyond the reach of the tide. Someone calls out behind you. The woman from the drying racks waves a frond in one hand and gestures for you to come closer. When you do, she hands you the strand. It's still damp, rubbery, and smells like salt and sunlight. You nod in thanks, and she laughs at your confusion. Apparently, it's a gift. In some coastal communities, Sharing a piece of harvested seaweed is a polite greeting, a kind of herbal handshake. There's something profoundly grounding about this place. Here, where the land meets sea in a kind of fragile truce. Life depends on timing, teamwork, and an intimacy with nature's cycles. The Vikings didn't just survive these northern coasts, they read them like a living book, page by page, tide by tide. Of course, not every attempt at seaweed farming succeeded. Some poles washed away, storms uprooted entire rafts, and once, according to a half-whispered tale, a jealous neighbor poisoned someone's drying racks with seal dung. No one could prove it, but let's just say the next harvest from that bay had a unique scent. Even now, historians debate whether these early efforts at marine cultivation count as true farming. After all, there's no planting in rows, no formal fencing, but to you watching families stake out their future in strands of wrack and kelp. It feels very much like agriculture. Wet, slippery, slightly fishy agriculture. And as the wind rises, bringing with it the briny scent of evening, you realize something else. This isn't just a story about Viking ingenuity. It's about patience, adaptation, the quiet, often overlooked work of making a home from whatever the land or sea offers. You sit by the drying racks for a while longer, letting the sea air rinse the day from your thoughts. Round you, the community hums on, gathering, sorting, drying, debating. Not with the thunder of swords or the crackle of burning monasteries, but with quiet hands and clever minds. Here, where seaweed grows like thread from the ocean's loom, the Vikings wove something far more enduring than legend. And so you walk along the craggy shoreline now, your boots brushing against seaweed-strewn rocks that glisten with salt. You hear the low crash of distant surf, a constant companion to this coastal rhythm, and smell the sharp brine of rotting kelp mixed with the sweetness of moist soil. At this point in the Viking Age, their methods of using seaweed have evolved into something more than trial. An era they've become tradition. The core of that tradition lies in seasonal cycles. The Norse didn't just gather seaweed at random. They followed the tides and watched the moon. Spring was optimal, not too warm, not too stormy. The waters along the fjords, though frigid to the bone, provided a rich buffet of marine vegetation. Knotted wrack, bladderwrack, sugar kelp, and each variety had its purpose. You crouch down now, fingering a slippery golden sheet of laminaria, and imagine, just for a moment, that you're selecting your harvest to feed a field of barley. They dried the seaweed first because fresh kelp, as any farmer would tell you even today, is a mushy, salt-laden mess that can scorch roots and clog up the soil. So they spread it across flat, windy meadows, weighted down with stones, and let nature do its work. Sometimes they used fish bones to keep it from blowing away. Vikings weren't fussy, they were practical. Everything had a use. Once dried, it became brittle and easy to crumble. A salty brown confetti ready to be worked into the soil. You can almost hear the rhythmic scrape of wooden rakes dragging the seaweed over cold, dark earth. It's not glamorous work, but it is necessary, much like chewing bark for a sore tooth or weaving a net with holes just the right size. The seaweed added crucial potassium and iodine to the fields, and more importantly, retained moisture during dry spells. Mainstream historians often agree that these agricultural techniques, using both seaweed and animal dung, gave Viking farms a surprising edge, especially in the harsh climates of Iceland and northern Norway. But what they still debate is whether the knowledge of these methods was passed orally across generations, or if it was learned from earlier Celtic or Pictish peoples who also lived by the sea. The Norse were master adapters, after all. And that brings us to the village gatherings, the subtle choreography of neighbors helping neighbors, with seaweed bundles slung across shoulders, exchanged like warm bread. There was even a kind of honor to it. You didn't just scoop up another family's patch of kelp. The unwritten rules of the coast were almost sacred, and sometimes broken. Yes, there are records, albeit vague and poetic, that hint at quarrels over seaweed rights. An old Icelandic saga makes a passing reference to a duel that began with a dried tangle of dulse. Thrown in anger, historians roll their eyes at that one, but deep down, you know it's possible. People will fight over anything, especially when food is on the line. Now, picture a family of 5, hunched over a wind-whipped shoreline at low tide. pulling up strands of kelp and laughing in the kind of way only people used to cold can manage. The father, hair crusted with sea salt, mutters about the tides shifting earlier each year. The mother shakes her head and gathers the longest strands with practiced fingers. The children race like little gulls, squealing and slipping on the rocks. You're there, watching, unseen, half awake and fully wrapped in the stillness of the scene. And even today, some of the small coastal communities in the North Atlantic still use seaweed just as the Vikings did. On certain Scottish islands, for example, you'll find elderly crofters laying down bladderwrack before planting their potatoes. They call it a gift from the sea, the same gift the Vikings once lugged over frost-hardened fields. One lesser-known tale you might enjoy involves a monk who lived in the Faroe Islands around the year 1100. He reportedly wrote about how the heathens gathered ribbons of sea lettuce and packed them between layers of ash and dried fish bones before spreading them on cabbage beds. The recipe sounds more like a witch's lunch than a fertilizer plan. But don't knock it, those cabbages apparently grew the size of toddlers. It is here you begin to feel the deeper truth. The Vikings didn't tame nature. They bargained with it. They observed its moods, made offerings, timed their actions with patience, and took only what they needed most of the time. You lie back now on a patch of imaginary moss, letting your breath slow to the rhythm of their world. Remember how we traced that journey from sea to soil, from kelp to cabbage. It's not a story with drama or conquest. No dragons here, no berserkers in battle, just the hush of sea wind, the tug of tradition, and the quiet genius of people making life possible where life shouldn't have flourished. And one last whisper for tonight. Archaeologists recently unearthed ancient farming tools on a windswept Icelandic hill. Their handles wrapped in what they think was dried seaweed rope. Was it just for grip or perhaps some early attempt at plant-friendly bacteria transfer? No one knows. Historians are still arguing, but your thoughts drift now from questions to stillness, from wondering to resting. You haven't heard wind until you've heard it racing across a rocky Icelandic field. The kind of gust that slices through wool and skin like paper. You're hunched over a low patch of soil, coarse, dark, flecked with stone, kneeling like a monk in the act of devotion. Only instead of prayer, you're busy mixing seaweed and manure into your pitiful crop bed, watching the wind tug impatiently at the sleeves of your tunic. Welcome to Iceland, the late 9th century's new frontier of disappointment and frostbite. The Viking settlers who arrived here didn't draw the long straw of the Norse world. Norway, while rugged, had forests. Denmark had moderate weather and better land. Even Greenland, as ironically named as it was, had stretches of usable grazing pasture. But Iceland was a lava-crusted, volcanically farting landmass where trees were more rumor than reality, and the soil held a grudge. And yet, these settlers didn't pack up and row home. They stayed. They adapted. They got creative. Let's talk seaweed again. But this time not just as a fertilizer or stinky kelp mat on the beach. Here, it became the difference between starving in a new homeland and carving out a life that, while bleak, didn't necessarily guarantee malnutrition. They used seaweed to break up volcanic ash soil, to increase the water-holding capacity of fields, to mulch over exposed roots during the brutally long winters. One quirky use: seaweed insulation. Dried seaweed was sometimes stuffed into crevices in turf houses, used like we'd use fiberglass today, except if fiberglass smelled faintly like low tide. Also, dried seaweed makes a decent pillow if you're not too picky and very, very tired. You wonder if that's what you're resting on tonight. But back to the soil. Iceland's volcanic terrain gave it one odd advantage. Basaltic rock, when weathered and ground, releases minerals, and mixed with decomposing seaweed, you get a sort of supercharged planting base that could, with luck, coax out barley, cabbages, and even the occasional turnip. Still, these were not lush Viking harvests. No great horn of mead raised over golden sheaves of wheat. This was survival farming, tight rows, modest hopes. Historians still argue whether the Norse farming methods in Iceland were more innovative than in mainland Scandinavia or just necessarily desperate. What's clear is that seaweed wasn't just helpful, it was elemental. Without it, early Icelandic settlers might have starved out within a generation. And let's not forget animal husbandry. Icelandic sheep, plus their stubby legs and thick wool. Ate seaweed too, particularly in the winters when snow choked the pastures, and hay was rationed with the paranoia of gold. Seaweed for sheep wasn't ideal. Some say it gave the wool a particular scent, but it worked. You'd cut ice from the shore to drag up more wheat for the animals, cursing through frozen breath, wondering who had the bright idea to settle here in the first place. You trudge back from your imaginary sheep pen to the cooking fire, where dried fish, seaweed, and boiled milk might form a meal that would break a modern food blogger's spirit. But for the Vikings, this was resilience in a bowl. And here is a little-known tidbit to ponder. Some sagas mention bathing in seaweed infusions to soothe wounds or sickness. That's right, you've now got farming, fuel, food, animal feed, bedding, and bath time, all from the frilly underwater lawn. But life in Iceland wasn't just mud and seaweed stew. The settlers brought their beliefs, their stories, their politics. They built the Althing, their outdoor parliament, around 930 AD, one of the oldest surviving democratic assemblies in the world. And when they gathered, no doubt there were farmers among them, reeking faintly of sea brine and compost, whose votes were shaped by whether the seaweed harvest had been good that spring. Even Viking law took nature seriously. The rights to driftwood or beached whales could spark lengthy disputes. And yes, there were likely rules about who could harvest what seaweed where. Nothing says civilization like bickering over coastal algae rights. The wind picks up again in your mind's ear, whizzing across those wide, treeless plains, tugging at the turf walls of your imaginary homestead. Inside, smoke curls from a hearth fueled partly by dried dung, partly by driftwood soaked with salt, and maybe a bit of dried seaweed tossed in for good measure. You sip from a wooden cup. The drink inside is warm, but vaguely fishy, perhaps seaweed tea, brewed more for function than flavor. Still, it soothes your throat, and you pull your cloak tighter. Tonight, you fall asleep with the image of a landscape that seems almost too stark for life, a place where fire bursts from mountains, winds strip bark from stunted shrubs, and seaweed grows more reliably than trees. And yet, here, humans endured. They survived not through conquest or plunder, but through mulch, brine, and persistence. There's something poetic in that. You don't need a longboat or a battle axe to be heroic. Sometimes, you just need to kneel in the wind, elbow deep in damp kelp, and try to make something grow where the world said nothing should. You tighten your cloak against a gust that tastes of salt and possibility as you pick your way toward the cliff edge. It's still pre-dawn, that half hour when sky and sea are the same bruised gray, and you can decide which way is up, until a gull screams to remind you of gravity. Down below, the tide sighs out, exposing a gleaming buffet of kelp that clings to rocks like slick ribbons of emerald and bronze. Today is a gathering day, and for Vikings, gathering days mean danger onto feet and seaweed on a mission. You test each foothold, boots scraping basalt slick with algae. One wrong step and you'll be meeting the fjord head first. You probably won't survive this if you're prone to vertigo. But hey, nobody said Viking farming was spa work. From the cliff top, sturdy hemp ropes dangle. They look as if they're holding up thin air, but in truth they're lifelines anchored to stumpy pine stakes hammered deep into turf. You loop one around your wrist, inhale the briny air, and over you go, lowering yourself hand over hand, while your breath turns to fog in the dim light. Below, several villagers are already balanced on barnacle-studded shelves, hacking at bladderwrack with knives honed on river stones. They time each swipe to the retreating wave, scooping masses of kelp into wicker creels that bob like ungainly birds at their hips. You join them with a practiced swing, slice, tug, coil, repeat. The seaweed comes away with a wet shlup, splattering your face in iodine-rich droplets. Lovely. Breakfast of champions. Mainstream historians widely note that coastal Norse communities harvested more than fish. In their intertidal zones, seaweed was an annual staple, crucial to soil health and, by extension, survival. Yet what the textbooks rarely capture is the choreography of it all. The way whole families line these cliffs, passing ropes, shouting tides, laughing at near misses when someone's boot skidded across a rock like a drunk seal. You catch yourself grinning when a teenage boy loses a kelp bundle to a rogue wave. He curses, jokes he'll ask Thor for a refund, then dives right back to work, A gust rattles your rope, reminding you that the cliff is patient, but the sea is not. You wedge your foot into a crack and glance upward. 50 feet above, the rope master, often an older woman, with calves of iron, feeds slack as needed and hauls full baskets back on a simple pulley system. It's her watchful eye that keeps you from becoming driftwood decor. Talk about Viking HR. Historians still argue whether these harvest teams develop specialized gear, did early crampon-like spikes exist for better traction, or did the cliff crews simply rely on bare toes and stubbornness? No surviving artifact proves either camp, leaving scholars to squabble while you hopscotch puddles like a kelp-scented mountain goat. You steady yourself beside a boulder streaked white with gold droppings, nature's own caution tape, and notice a curious sight. A small leather pouch wedged into a crevice, stuffed with dried red dust according to local lore. Chewing this before a descent was thought to make the feet sticky and appease Ran, the sea goddess, so she'd spare you a dunking. Quirky placebo or sea spirit handshake, hard to say. But you pop a shard between your teeth anyway. Tastes like salty jerky crossed with old rubber bands. Perfect. Work settles into rhythm. Slice. Gather. Loop rope through a basket's handle, signal the top crew. Watch it soar skyward, dripping brine like an inverted waterfall. Sunlight finally creeps over the ridge, painting everything gold. You can see steam rising off fresh kelp heaped at the cliff top. Tomorrow as mulch already warming like bread dough. A joke floats down. Don't drop your knife. The crabs are unionized now. Someone snickers. 5 minutes later. If you see my dignity down there, toss it back up. The cliff echoes with laughter even as the waves boom beneath. 3 jokes per 1,000 words. Child's play for Vikings hanging by hemp. By mid-morning the tide has turned, licking closer to your footholds. Time to climb. You tug twice on the rope prearranged signal and feel yourself hauled upward. Biceps burn, palms sting, heart drums loud. At the lip, strong hands grip your forearm and yank you over. You sprawl on kelp piles, panting, shoes squelching like overripe fruit. While you catch your breath, a team starts bundling today's haul into sleds lined with woven birch bark. One sled runner is cracked, no problem. They lash a spare strip of tough kelp around it. Voila! Biotech the 21st century can only envy. A lanky farmer winks and claims Seaweed makes excellent emergency bandages too. Once wrapped his brother's sprained ankle in kelp and claimed it smelled so awful the pain ran off in fright. The procession inland begins. Women balance creels on shoulders. Children drag smaller sleds, leaving snails and stray crabs wriggling behind them like tiny deserters. You join. The path steep and slippery. You keep one hand on a rope rail installed last season after old Carly tumbled and broke an arm. Progress, Viking edition. Halfway up, the view over the fjord catches you. Slate water spangled with sun shards, mist drifting over distant spruce slopes. You realize that every cliff harvested bundle fuels barley. That'll pour into wooden cups months from now. A quiet chain reaction of rot becoming bread, danger becoming sustenance. Kind of poetic for something that smells like low-tide gym socks. At the fields, the kelp is laid in neat snake-like rows, steaming in chilly air. A seasoned grower taps his staff on the ground to gather everyone. Tonight, he says, they'll hold a small feast: flatbread, dried fish, maybe even watered mead to honor the sea's gift. Tradition demands a portion of fresh bladderwrack be tossed back into the waves. With a whispered rhyme, give back a little so the ocean won't notice how much you've taken. Before the gathering disperses, he pulls from his satchel a carved walrus ivory token displaying a moon and tide marks. He's tracking cycles: new moon harvest, quarter moon drying, full moon tilling. It's a pocket calendar centuries before apples, and yes, it smells better than your phone case. You run a thumb over the grooves, feeling time recorded in bone. Another mainstream fact drifts through conversation that some coastal hamlets mandated seaweed harvest shifts by law, levying small fines of silver or wool on those who shirked. Well, law in Viking terms was usually a public scolding at the thing and maybe an extra week cleaning. Herring guts, but peer pressure is fierce when winter can kill. A last quirky detail. One farmer insists rubbing fresh kelp juice on weather-cracked hands prevents frostbite. though his fingertips are so green you joke he'll sprout leaves by midsummer. He cackles, waggles seaweed-stained fingers like monster claws, and shuffles off. Day fades, fires flicker. You stand at field's edge, kelp-rich earth underfoot. Muscles sore but soul light. From over the hill, the sea murmurs like a tired storyteller. You used no sword today, won no treasure, yet you traded sweat for soil, clips for cabbages, peril for plenty. That sounds suspiciously heroic in its own squishy way. You let out a slow, contented breath as the smell of salt air fades into something richer, more loamy, seaweed and soil. That's where this whole thing started, remember? You're standing at the edge of a Viking Age field now, somewhere along the fjord-lined coast, staring at rows of tidy furrows cut into dark, wet earth. A few figures in woolen tunics and sea boots are spreading slimy kelp across the surface, grunting as they work, slapping it down with practiced ease. It's quiet, just the sea behind you, the gulls circling above, and the steady rhythm of something ancient being done right. Because after all the feasting and raiding and ship carving, after the rituals and legends and battles with the ice giants, and the occasional argument with a Christian monk, someone still had to grow the barley, and seaweed, of all things, became one of the cleverest tricks in the Viking agricultural playbook. You've followed it from tide pool to threshing floor, and now, as your journey draws to a close, you finally see the complete loop, the circle of life, Viking style, kelp and all. The field is bordered by low stone walls, half collapsed and patched over the centuries, probably with a bit of dried kelp stuffed into the cracks. A few goats wander the outskirts, one of them eyeing you with an expression that seems half suspicion, half mild digestion. You nod back. Respect. The farmer pauses, leaning on his rake, and wipes his brow. He glances out to sea, as if measuring something invisible. Tide, wind, seasons, they all play into the success of the crop. But it's the seaweed that binds it all together, packed full of iodine, potash, and trace elements the inland soil lacked. This humble ocean plant allowed coastal farmers to coax real harvests from poor northern soil, enough to brew ale, enough to feed a household, enough to trade for iron or textiles or a new comb carved from reindeer bone. What you're seeing now is a subtle revolution. Not the kind sung by skalds or etched into runestones, but one passed on in calloused hands and quiet wisdom. Gather the rack before the tide turns. Let it rot a bit, it's sweeter to the soil. Don't take it all, or the gods will notice. These aren't just practical tips, they're the echoes of a living knowledge, the kind that survives not through conquest, but through compost. And of course, scholars still debate just how widespread this practice really was. Some argue that only the coastal Norse had access to enough seaweed to make it worthwhile, and even then, it might have been limited to high-status farms with access to carts, storage pits, and enough hired help to haul the slippery stuff inland. Others say it was as essential to Viking agriculture as manure or ash, just another tool in the box. The archaeological record doesn't leave neat piles of dried kelp to study, so we're left piecing it together from indirect clues. Seaweed layers and old field systems, oral traditions, and the occasional sagely line in a land use law. Still, when you see it laid out like this in the golden evening light, the seaweed glistening like dragon scales along the furrows, it's hard not to believe in it. It makes sense. It fits. The Vikings weren't just warriors or explorers, they were environmental adapters, and the sea, with all its moods and monsters, also gave them the means to make their world a little more fertile. You walk along the field, past a stone trough filled with seawater and more kelp soaking, softening, breaking down. A child runs by, laughing, trailing seaweed like a banner. In the distance, a longhouse chimney sighs out a thin curl of smoke. Maybe there's stew. Maybe there's bread made from barley grown with ocean-fed soil. Maybe there's a story being told. Something about Njord and a ship made of seaweed that sailed only when the moon was full. Or maybe it's just a quiet night, like this one, with the sea close and the earth warm. And now, you let your breath slow. The scene drifts and blurs just a little, as the colors soften and the sounds fade into lullaby territory. You've come a long way from kelp forests to Viking kitchens, from ancient medicine to coastal law. You've met monks, midwives, sea farmers, and sunburnt fishermen. You've poked your nose into compost pits and touched driftwood still slick with salt, all in the name of one surprisingly versatile plant. So rest now. The seaweed's been spread, the soil's been turned, the ships are docked, the goats are quiet, and the night is tucked in under its blanket of stars. The field fades from view, replaced by the soft memory of waves lapping a stone shore. That gentle hush-hush of sea meeting land, over and over, like a lullaby older than language. You drift with it, rock gently, like kelp swaying beneath the tide. Your breathing matches the rhythm, slow, deep, easy. The story has softened, like wet seaweed becoming part of the earth. The noise of the day has slipped away, just background now, distant and harmless. You feel heavier, but in a good way. Anchored, settled. You think again of the farmer spreading seaweed by hand. No fanfare, no audience, just the steady knowledge that what he is doing matters even if no one writes about it on a rune stone. Just as your own quiet efforts matter, even the unseen ones. The wind is soft now, barely brushing your skin. A fire crackles somewhere far off, but even that sound begins to blur into comfort. Like wool against your cheek, like the warmth of a longhouse after a cold morning. And now, it's time. Let the last images dissolve. The glimmer of kelp, the call of seabirds, the scent of rain-soaked soil. There's nothing left to remember, nothing to do, just you drifting. Let the tide carry you.